Stage, somebody who is popularly known as modern inframan amongst industry professionals. Please put your hands together for Metropolitan Commissioner MMRDA, Mr. R.A. Rajeev. Mr. R.A. Rajeev, IAS and the Metropolitan Commissioner of MMRDA. He received his postgraduate degrees in political science from Allahabad University and public administration from Maxwell School of the University of Syracuse. He has held many prestigious posts over the last 3 decades, such as Municipal Commissioner of Thane City, Principal Secretary for Environment, Finance and Home, Joint Secretary Finance and Department of Atomic Energy. A very warm welcome to you, sir. We have 2 panel members who are going to be live streamed here since they couldn't make it here physically to this session, but we are going to ensure they are part of this panel discussion by video conference. I'm now going to welcome Dr. Philip Rode, LSE Cities. Can we start connecting the video conference? To tell you a little bit about Dr. Rode, he is the Executive Director of LSE Cities and Associate Professorial Research Fellow at LSE. He is the Co-Director of the LSE Executive MSc in Cities and co-convenes the LSE Sociology course City Making. The Politics of Urban Form. As a researcher and consultant and advisor, he has been directing interdisciplinary projects comprising urban governance, transport, city planning, and urban design at LSE since 2003. His current work focuses on institutional structures, governance, and capacities of cities, and sustainable urban development, transport, and mobility. Moving forward, I am going to now welcome on stage my next panel member. We have with us Honorable Mayor of Surat, Dr. Jagdish Patel. Let's welcome sir on stage with a big round of applause. He is the 36th and current mayor of Surat City. He is one of the senior-most councillors at Surat Municipal Corporation. He is an Ayurvedic doctor and a founder trustee of 500-bedded multi-super speciality hospitals in Surat. His proactive approach towards city administration and management of urban affairs has led to Surat touching greater heights. A very warm welcome to you, sir. I am also going to welcome on stage my next panel member, Executive Engineer, Surat Municipal Corporation, Mr. D.C. Gandhi. Let's applaud for all our panel members. Come on, ladies and gentlemen. He is a civil engineer having vast experience in public health engineering works. He has worked in various disciplines of civil engineering and public works. In ULB, for the last 32 years, he has often faced and worked on difficult disaster mitigation works. Presently, he holds the post of Senior Additional City Engineer, working on climate change and city resilience work, especially on Tapi Shuddhikaran Water Plaza works and exploring rooftops. Joining them is my next panel member. We have with us Mr. G.G. Thompson, former Chief Secretary, Government of Kerala. He belongs to the 1980 batch of IAS Kerala. During his official career spanning 36 years, he has held many important posts for both the government of Kerala and for the government of India. He is currently holding the position of Independent Director, Cochin Shipyard. A very warm welcome to Mr. Thompson. We have yet another panel member who is going to be connecting with us via video conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George. He is a senior scientist at ISMAR, ISMAR, which is Institute of Marine Science, Italy. In 1986, he has held a degree from the University of Hamburg. In physics, he has also completed his visiting professorship from University of Fukuoka, Japan. He specializes in the study of lagoons and other water bodies through the application of numerical modes, mainly in the field of hydrodynamics and sediment transport. A very warm welcome to all my panel members. Dr. Chaudhary, over to you.
Well, Chaturvedi still. Yeah, I wish I could become a Chaudhary very soon, because I'm becoming a panel moderator way too often. We have a star cast, as you can see. There's 6 speakers, and we have very little time. But I want to get the best out of sort of the key messages out of everyone. So I would actually start with Mr. Rajeev. You're sort of the Metropolitan Commissioner. You're, of course, being already branded the infrastructure sort of guru. And please share with us sort of your critical challenges, what you face as challenges, and how are you planning to overcome them?
I'm still a student, not a guru. The critical challenges for Mumbai and the metropolitan region, I can count them on my fingertips. The biggest challenge for this city is when I say that you are working for mega infrastructure projects in the city, including metro lines and underground metro lines and different elevated corridors, as well as the sea bridge. When the city is working, and it's known that Mumbai never sleeps, but it's also known in infrastructure sector that in Mumbai, not a single road is ever closed for any infrastructure work. This doesn't happen anywhere, number one. So it's like you are operating a person for open heart surgery when the person is working. So this is how you have to work in Mumbai to build infrastructure. Number two is that no other city in the world has ever built simultaneously 200 kilometers of metro lines at a time, which Mumbai at present is doing. And Mumbai has planned for 337 kilometer long metro lines, of which 200 is being built at present. And others are very soon going to be on the block, and they will also, the work will also start immediately. The third biggest challenge is that in order to do all these infrastructures, you have to mobilize financial resources. MMRDA doesn't depend upon either state government or the central government for any type of grant or funding. And still we are doing it. So these are the three major challenges. There are other challenges, I can say. When you build the infrastructure, you have so many agencies to coordinate, you have so many underground utilities and everyday surprises which spring up before you when you get up in the morning, that in the night in some area some water supply was stopped because of some digging and all. So all sorts of minor challenges, we call it the minor challenges. So these are, I can enumerate, and as the discussion will proceed, I can share some more. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. Moving on to the presentation, because I think we'll have to give sufficient amount of time for the people who are joining us through video conferencing, because I can't be doing a little bit too much of a back and forth with them. So I'll start with Mr. Philip Road, Dr. Philip Road, who's from LSE Cities. So Philip, if you could actually talk to us a little bit about this global perspective on transport, land use and governance, with a focus on mitigation, climate change mitigation.
Yes, that's right. Good afternoon. I'm calling in from Tangier, where there is a summit by United Cities and local government. And I'm fortunately not in the room with you, but I hope you can hear me. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. We can hear you clearly.
So I will now share my presentation, and I will present for about 15 minutes and then hand over to the colleagues. So let me see whether technology will work. Just give me a second here. Okay, so I'm seeing how the slides are building up. Excellent. So I was asked to really bring back the theme of the conference on ultimately protection against climate change to the mitigation agenda. And a lot of things have happened here over the last year. And I'll focus specifically on the issue of transport, land use, and the governance implications. So the four aspects I would like to cover is first to go back to the gradual mitigation agenda. This is the climate change agenda in cities we have been seeing evolving over the last 30 years. It's consolidated. It then leads to the second aspect of more integrated governance. And then we have a break. And that break happened about a year ago with a new narrative around a climate emergency. And I then want to leave you with some implications around this climate emergency. So let's start with the gradual mitigation agenda. And if we're thinking about cities as a system, and the long-term concerns around how can we make cities more less carbon intense, we're immediately thinking, of course, of reducing their energy need. And the number one issue here in the long term is their metropolitan urban form. What you can see here are more or less all countries in the world plotted on the horizontal against the density of their major metropolitan regions, and then on the vertical, the energy consumption per capita. And that's a pretty good proxy still today for carbon emissions. The denser our cities are, the more efficient they are, the less carbon emission you have, broadly speaking. That comes from transport, that comes from building energy efficiency. The compaction of our cities is a fantastic source of efficiency. Now, of course, if you look at these countries here, you will see that a lot of the developing world countries are naturally more dense, and particularly in the US and Australia, you have the least dense cities. That's, of course, there is a function of wealth. As cities become wealthy historically, they have been de-densifying. But look at the 4 dots which I have coded here in red: Hong Kong, Singapore, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Essentially city-states at similar wealth levels, but very divergent urban forms. And you can see the energy efficiency of the higher density Singapore and Hong Kong very clearly. The East Asian cities have a massive advantage here when it comes to climate adaptation. So what we are seeing is an ideal around compact, connected, and coordinated urban growth. If built around mass public transport, this creates not only economically more dynamic cities, but also healthier cities, and then they have lower emissions. There's fairly consensual perspectives around this logic within the scientific and urban community. The problem is, when we look at the actual dynamics of growth globally, we are seeing a massive horizontal expansion of our cities and a massive land grab of urban environments. The current predictions are from 2000 to 2030, a 3-fold increase of urban land, while the population is only increasing in these urban areas by a factor of 1.5. So we're losing out on these efficiencies of density, the efficiency of moving ourselves in a better way, having greater accessibility and overall greater resource efficiency. And that is deeply worrying. Now, what are cities doing as part of a gradual long-term mitigation agenda? Well, they embrace transit-oriented development and intensification. London is a good case. Mumbai in many ways as well, where you have rapid built-up of higher density, not just population densities, but built environment densities, building densities. What you see in this chart is where London added new buildings, both for living and working, and it's mostly in more central locations and around public transport. Another important agenda is to create hard edges between the city and the natural habitat. Here, a photograph from Copenhagen, where we don't want to anymore have these cities to fizzle out and have nondescript urban agglomerations in their sort of peripheral hinterlands, which are then often very resource intensive. And a third example around land use is to rezone for mixed use. Now, Indian cities are traditionally fantastically mixed use. That's a huge advantage. In Chinese cities, this is increasing now, again, a newer agenda. Here, an area that was entirely monofunctional, only dedicated to housing, but new functions have been added, shops, retail, and increasingly also offices. That is helping with this urban efficiency and ultimately reducing carbon emissions. In transport, we learned the hard lesson that building more roads is not going to help. This is Beijing. It really tried it with the biggest amount of resources you can imagine in the world. Adding flyovers, adding bridges, highway capacity will not solve traffic congestion. And in fact, it will entirely ruin the urban environment, and it will ruin the climate mitigation agenda. Transport is the hardest sector to crack. We are seeing massive increases in carbon emissions in transport, and cities are now leading the way with alternative approaches around public transport, around non-motorized transport, more mixed use, as I referred to before, and really integrating the transport function with the overall accessibility function which cities can provide us with. We recently conducted work amongst transport experts around the world, understanding really within transport policy, also national transport policy, what's important to produce better cities and cities that are more capable in mitigating climate change. Infrastructure budget reallocation away from road building and into public transport, walking and cycling, introducing road pricing and having land value capture for transit-oriented development are among the most important initiatives here. So let's move on to integrated governance, because this is an agenda which of course needs to be reflected in our governance systems. If there's one central message across all of those signature reports around sustainable urban development, it is the joining up of our thinking, and it's the joining up of our institutions to no longer consider environmental issues separate from economic and separate from social issues. But how do we do this? Well, the first thing is to say cities are uniquely placed to really help us in bringing together very different sectoral areas of policy making, often at the national level or at the state level, because they understand the territory, the places they need to make these policies work for. The city level integrates good metropolitan governance, and Mumbai is a good example of this. Metropolitan planning exists here, bringing together these sectors and then breaking it down into distinct and specific projects that deliver on the ground. I want to share with you one example of a city I live in, and that's London. And you may have come across that a lot of transport initiatives have been celebrated worldwide. The last 20 years have seen a lot of interesting transport policy and projects in the city. What's often forgotten about this success is that it started with an institutional reform. This was the governance arrangement for London transport before 2000. It was a mess. It was fragmented across national, regional, and then local authorities. It was divided into different sectors of transport. A reform kicked in, and since 2000, we have a very coherent Metropolitan Transport Authority directly reporting to the mayor. It brings together all forms of travel, whether it's by car, by bus, by tube, and all the different non-motorized modes. It's taken care of by one institution working in collaboration with the land use planners. So there are a few important takeaways which we are now also scaling and testing in other contexts, most recently in Ethiopia. City level leadership matters. This is such an important message, I think, still for Indian cities. Devolve responsibilities to metropolitan governance is incredibly important. Develop around urban places rather than sectors. Have multi-sectoral delivery agencies, task forces, working groups, and ultimately work with an integrated urban strategy. Equally, embark in multi-criteria assessments that don't, in some ways, prioritize only one big metric, let's say GDP, over other important metrics. Use new communication technologies to bring people together, and then, of course, a whole range of knowledge building and capacity building. So this is the gradual agenda. This is what we have seen so far, with some progress, but for 1 year, as I mentioned before, there is a changing climate around thinking around the climate events, and we are now seeing a new emergency evolving. And I want to just briefly open up what that implies, because it's entirely different from what I have mentioned up until now. This chart should be familiar to you. This is the this is the temperature increase from 1850 up until now. We're having much more evidence that the world is warming at a pace which is incredibly dangerous. We are seeing events. This is Lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy hit, a blackout in the city. Most of the lower parts of the island flooded. These are not just issues which affect places in less developed countries, but here we are seeing a new concern around climate change adaptation. We are having images far beyond our urban centers which remind us that our world is in trouble. This was produced last summer, this image from Greenland. This should be ice and snow in the back. Instead, it's water and almost sort of gray greenish hills. Hugely problematic, as we all know. The World Economic Forum has released over the last 20 years its global risk report, mapping all sorts of different risks on a scale of likelihood and impact. And most recently, major environmental concerns are now the maximum in terms of likelihood and the maximum in terms of impact. Huge discussions of how can we deal with this. We can no longer ignore the situation. That is absolutely clear. And the youth is responding. People in the street are responding. They are demanding that we declare climate emergencies and that we accelerate actions far beyond what we have done to date. And here's the worrying chart. If we started with a very good emission reduction strategy in 2000, the gradual agenda I introduced before would have worked, no problem. But since 2000, we have increased emissions far more than we anticipated, and the declining curve, which we require to keep a safe climate, is incredibly steep. To give you a sense of what this translates to globally a reduction of greenhouse gases every year by 7.6%. That's the latest estimate by the United Nations Environment Programme. We have not seen this in any country under normal circumstances so far, anywhere in the world. If we translate that number to places like London, New York, and Berlin in the West, it's easily 15% reduction per year by the end of that year required. That's not going to happen with the type of interventions around manipulating our urban environments. We need some much more urgent action. So this brings me to emergency governance, which is a new approach of addressing this conundrum. Cities actually are quite good in terms of dealing with emergencies. They have a lot of powers when it comes to these emergencies, which we know from certain weather conditions, from maybe also sort of health crises as we're currently seeing it, or indeed from terrorist attacks. This is the Central Operations Room in Rio de Janeiro, which was built around a better response to flood events, coordinated actions. But it does ask some really critical questions when we shift this kind of short-term emergency towards the grand challenges of climate change and treating it as an emergency. It's very top-down. How democratic can the rollout of policies be, and so on? We simply do not know. So here's the new narrative. The radical decarbonization I just referred to. We need to be much more honest about how we calculate carbon. Even the great green cities of the Scandinavian countries, Copenhagen, Stockholm, they look good only if you consider the locally produced carbon. If you include so-called Scope 3 emissions from abroad, the way these cities consume, it is actually pretty miserable. So this honesty, and the new honesty, is critical. We also need to be careful with net zero targets, because ultimately in the long run, offsetting carbon emissions isn't going to help the climate, and it's going to be very expensive. What we instead now need is to bring the politics towards a buy-in of much broader fractions of society. We need to mobilize society, and we need to activate an entire new range of policy instruments, which so far have been taboos. And we are even starting to talk about issues of rationing in the context of, for example, car use in many Western cities. We recently worked with our own executive masters in cities and the C40 cities leader network on climate emergency responses for 4 cities. And I want to leave you with a few ideas that have been emerging here. In Warsaw, a city that's still very dependent on coal for both electricity and heating, within a very short period, rapid interventions and rollout of new technology, but ultimately facilitated by a response by populations, taking actions themselves. In Milan, where the big leadership is already in the context of food, it's a shift away from diets which are meat heavy towards so-called safe planet diets. In Oslo, the construction sector, again, an area where we rarely considered the enormous amount of embedded carbon in steel and concrete, a shift towards wood and timber construction, and potentially even a moratorium on buildings while we don't have the technology and the materials that reduce carbon emission. And in London on transport, I mentioned this already before, a much more radical initiative around shifting people out of their vehicles and into walking, cycling, and public transport. This requires us to build bridges between strategies to tactics. We need to know much more about our stakeholders. We need to address barriers proactively, and there are many. There will be losers in this radical acceleration of decarbonization. We need to get the timing right of our politics, communicate effectively. Yes, integrate technical expertise, that will be very important. And most importantly, we need to show what change looks like, because this is not going to be a sacrifice. This is going to be better for urban societies, will be a healthier city system. There will be so many co-benefits for life on the ground. That is what we need to experience in terms of trials and experiments already this year, ideally. So I leave you with this final slide. This is me on a former runway in Berlin Tegel Airport. I know I'm not joining you today in person. The issue of global aviation is also part of an emergency consideration. I hope, nevertheless, that this time of virtual communication works. You were able to listen to me, and we could all make a contribution to accepting that we are in a state of emergency around our climate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Philip. Yeah, and of course, we've actually avoided several tons of carbon dioxide emission by just avoiding this one flight. So, of course, that's very good. My humble request to my fellow panelists, I'll have to really sort of request you to stick to maybe 5 to 7 minutes in your opening remarks so that we can actually have some sort of interaction with the sort of audience as well. So I have only 53 minutes, and there are 4 speakers. So I would start with the mayor, if he would sort of speak on behalf of the city, what the city is trying to do.
I will definitely help you. I am coming from Surat, the most resilient city, and it is situated on the bank of river Tapi. It is the delta. It is situated in Tapi River Basin, so flood-prone city. 326 square kilometer is the area, 6 million the population, and always struggling with flood situation. But since 2 decades, Surat had started to outcome of that situation. Nowadays, we are pioneer in some projects, such as we are treating all the sewerage water, and after tertiary treatment, we are providing to industries and get revenue from that. Almost 120 MLD water, tertiary treated water, we provide to industries and get revenue. Say, circular economy is a good example is for that. Now, to outcome that flood threaten, we going for one water plaza project that we have seen in Rotterdam, and with cooperation with EU and Rotterdam, we have prepared a project of water plaza, and my colleague, my executive engineer, additional city engineer, Deepak Bhai Gandhi is presenting that water plaza project of Surat Municipal Corporation. It's a very ambitious project for that. Deepak.
Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon all. So before presenting water plaza, first of all I want to address on flood mitigation issues. Surat has mainly 2 threats from river Tapi, and Tapi is having catchment length of around 900 kilometers. It is passing through 2 other states in India, and Surat is lying on the coast of sea. So naturally the flood, it is the highest the flood plot, and Surat has experienced many floods and devastating floods in 2006. Surat has other threats of creek floods. There are 3 creeks passed through Surat city, and the catchment length of all these 3 creeks are 300 kilometers in the length, and they are also having a very large catchment area in the neighboring districts. So rainfall pattern, looking to rainfall pattern and looking to delta region and lying on the coastal line, Surat has started studying Rotterdam with the cooperation of International Urban and European Union. I have just studied and visited Rotterdam last month in January, and I have visited 4 places at Rotterdam, one at Bentham Plain, and how to use water plaza, and how can we use it into Surat. Because Surat has a very good rainfall, having an event of a day, 100 to 200 rainfall may also occur so many times in monsoon. But Rotterdam is having rainfall event of only 40 25 to 40 one single event a day throughout the year. Rotterdam has throughout the year rainfall, while Surat has monsoon season and is having 4 months in monsoon. So in both cases, looking to rainfall conditions, looking to topographical conditions, Surat is 6 meter high mean sea level average, and Rotterdam is many places are minus level. So there are different issues in contesting to water plaza at Rotterdam and at also and Surat. Here our main aim in water plaza is to conserve the water and to replenish the water and to increase the water table level. While in Rotterdam, they have the problem of flooding, and they have very good, we have visited flood control center also. We have seen SCADA systems of their flood pumping stations and connected to bigger pumping stations, and they manage all to get together. And during rainfall, they have made a water plaza to store the water and to buy the time for pumping, so that pumping hours can be increased. They have made 1 meter plastic crates beneath the ground level, and they have made a buffer zone to store the rainfall water. While in our case, we have the problem of ingress of salinity in our area because we are nearby sea, so we want to retard the salinity. Also, we want to increase our water sources because the water sources is our main criteria as a resilient city. So, in water plaza, during 4 months of monsoon, we use it as a reservoir, and while in dry days, 8 months, we use it as a cultural cohesion, social cohesion, play activity. We want to give it to a sports academy, because in India, we have many streets, we have street play activities, street cricket culture, street volleyball culture. So we want to increase the sports culture also in the neighborhood and street area. So this is our main aim to water plaza. And by making water plaza, we will also reduce the, we will increase the urban cooling also. So that's why we have incepted water plaza project with Rotterdam. We have also taken up many climate changes projects like circular transport system. In past, if I say there may be a zero commuter in mass transportation system in last 5 to 7 years back. Now we have daily 3 lakh commuters in mass transportation system. As sir said, we are the only urban local bodies in India have implemented a tertiary treatment plant through sewage water system, capacity of 120 MLD. And we sold it to industries, and the project is purely a PPP model. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah.
For want of time, I will skip all the presentations.
Yeah, so
and just mention only the
Please.
important lessons we learned.
Please go ahead. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Okay. Friends, I come prepared with a video presentation. For want of time, I'm not going to show that presentation. In fact, I brought 2 presentations, 20 minutes and 5 minutes. Both I'm skipping. To give you a little bit of background, in the year 2015, when I became the Chief Secretary of Kerala, there was a heavy downpour, a 7 centimeter rainfall. It flooded the entire city, and suddenly I got a phone call from a person whom I am still not aware who it is. He rang me up from the central bus stations saying his plight, and said that, sir, please do something. The next day we took our engineers and made a on-the-spot inspection. And to my horror, I found that there are no drains. All the drains were clogged, and there was absolutely no way by which the rainwater could flow into the sea. And then, of course, it was presented before the cabinet, and the cabinet authorized me to take out an immediate operation. So I titled the operation. I titled the operation as Operation Ananta, and in the next 3 months or so, we went for a massive operation. It was mainly to find out the drains, and again I found that there was no drain mapping available in the with the corporation or with the concerned departments. Finally, I went to the archives department and took out the drain mapping done by the Maharaja of Travancore in the year 1935. And then started looking at where the drains are. We relocated them and cleaned it up and widened it, and finally 31 kilometers of drains were built in no time, and we spent something like 30 crores. And with the result that, the 2 years back we had a heavy, floods, and when the floods ravaged the entire state of Kerala, the city of Trivandrum was saved. There was no flooding in Trivandrum, mainly because of this operation. So this is all about the operation. I said it very simply, but then there were so many complications. So I'm asked to tell you what are the lessons we learned. Okay, number one, I will be very brief. Number one, first lesson is that there are multiple agencies working at cross purposes. You see, it's so easy to talk about climate change and talk about all these points, but then here, there are 3 people sitting here next to me. They know how difficult it is to get it implemented. Because there are some of the problems which we face is unimaginable. For example, in a small city of Trivandrum, we have how many agencies? PWD irrigation, PWD minor irrigation, PWD major irrigation, PWD roads. Then we have Trivandrum Development Authority, then Kerala Water Authority, then we have the city corporation. So 7 or 8 agencies are working on this field, and everyone will claim that, sir, that drain belongs to us, so the PWD irrigation has no business to enter there. If you do something, if it goes to some other place, they will say, no, sorry, this belongs to someone else. So coordinating these agencies is a very big challenge. That is number one. Number two, I found that there was a lack of interest in civic bodies, mainly because the civic bodies are not interested in waste management. They are not interested in these cleaning operations, because it is less glamorous. It doesn't, I don't know, your experience may be quite different. It's less glamorous. You've put an IAS officer in charge of these operations, he will shy away. For an IAS officer, what is the best option is to take up a commerce department or industries department, which will give him chances to go abroad. But where will an IAS officer get a chance to go abroad if he's asked to clean up the drains? And so there is no chance. And then third is, and I told you already, that the absence of mapping. There is absolutely nothing available. It's a shame. And fourth is eviction of encroachments. It's such a very difficult task. When we carried out the encroachments, because I was chief secretary, I said that we will go reckless. And in the process, we demolished temples, churches, and we had to remove banyan trees, which were considered to be sacred. And finally we had even to demolish some hotels, some 5-star hotels. In fact, I am still hauled up in a case in the Supreme Court. I don't know when they will punish me for what I did. And I had a very interesting experience, which I thought I should tell you. It is a very hilarious experience. When we started demolishing all these encroachments, in the process we also demolished a toilet of a poor woman, a widow. So when I visited the place, the old lady, she was into her 80s. She came and said, son, where can I go? I cannot go. My toilet I don't have a toilet. So please do something. So I immediately asked my engineers to construct a toilet for her. And to ensure that this has been done, I had to find out whether my orders have been carried out. The next day I paid a visit to that place, and I found that the toilet was constructed, but it was under lock and key. So I asked the woman, why are you not using it? So she said, now that you have given me a toilet, I want you to inaugurate the toilet. So I said in my 37, 39 years of experience, civil service, I never had this occasion to inaugurate a toilet. So this is another challenge which we people face. And then, of course, there are difficulties in widening drains in narrow settlements. And some of these big equipments which Mr. Goyal showed, it's very difficult to take into these roads. They are so small, so narrow, it's practically difficult to widen it. And then, of course, most of the houses on on the banks of these drains, they find it very convenient not to have septic tanks. They can always have the toilets, outlets jutting into the drains. So you know what will happen next. And then the lethal manhole and the sewer gas. Somewhere I had read in 1881 or so, the US President Garfield, his name was Garfield, he was shot by an assassin. Then he was taken to White House for recuperation, but his condition got worsened. So the experts found that it was not because on account of the bullet which was carrying on his body, but because of the sewer gas produced in the toilets in the White House. So if this can happen in White House, then what all things can happen elsewhere. So then, of course, we have a manual Scavengers and Rehabilitation Act of 2013, which prohibits manual scavenging. Of course, in my state, there is no manual scavenging, but it's so difficult to clean up the manholes. We have, some of our engineers startup companies have come out with a robot called Bandicoot. And, it can clean up certain areas, but it can't go into depths of 40 meters and all that. So then it becomes very difficult. How do you do it? And if you have to get this cleaned up, finally we had to depend on manual scavenging. But then the Act prevents. As Chief Secretary, I cannot be seen as violating an Act. So then, and of course the Act gives some exceptions. Like in extreme cases, you can make use of manual scavenging, but then there are 44 equipments which he should carry. But here the poor man doesn't carry any equipments except his bare hands. And then, of course, the contractors are very reluctant to carry out these operations because, you see, this is again, the big contractors will never come. You'll have to depend on small contractors. Their staying capacity is very limited. So then the problem is, you have to pay them regularly. In a city like Bombay or in Surat, I don't know, they have no fund problems. But whereas in my state, we are broke. My government is broke. Treasury, there's no money in the treasury. So we say, okay, you carry out the operation. When the contractor comes with his bill, we'll say that, yeah, we will see it later. And what will the poor man do? He will never be able to complete. Even the operation which we carried out in 2015, some contractors are yet to be paid. So this is another practical difficulty which I faced. Friends, then of course there is a Disaster Management Act of 2005, which has recently been amended. And there are very powerful provisions of the Disaster Management Act, which could be used for, mitigating floods. But unfortunately, most of the officers, will resort to these provisions only when the disaster strikes. In fact, this should be used for preventing rather than, you should not wait for the disaster to occur. And then, of course, is a lack of planning, less said about the better, and finally is short-termism. I have now put in nearly 4 decades in government, both in the state of Kerala and in government of India. And my experience tells me that none of the governments, none of the parties, whether it is left or right or the center, they are interested in taking up all these projects. They are not bothered about tomorrow. They are bothered only about today. If we have to carry out cleaning operations, waste management is an integral part. Without controlling the waste management, how do you do all these things? So, government, I have found that always are more bothered about today. The most determinant time for a government especially in Kerala, is 5 years. This their term, because they know that after 5 years, another party is going to come to power. So why take up all these big projects or think about the future? So now go only for short-term ad hoc programs. That is a major bane. That is something which I faced, so I think I will end up there.
Well. I'm so glad you did not make the presentation, because you were fantastic otherwise. I would actually, sort of before we move to Georg and sort of listen about the Venice case study, I would just like to quickly turn over to Mr. Rajeev again. Your sort of this MMRDA is supposed to sort of overcome some of these coordination problems and think about long-term planning. So maybe, of course, the experience over the 40 years would suggest a certain kind of sort of political behavior and how it constrains long-termism. But how does the MMRDA operate in spite of these constraints? And if you could highlight a couple of sort of examples or success stories that you could. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, in fact, my senior colleague from the surveys and heading one of the states in the country, whatever he has shared with us here this afternoon, so almost true for all the states, and more or less. And I have also worked as additional municipal commissioner of this city for 4 years. And I've been municipal commissioner of another city for 3 years. So long tenure in urban this thing. But let me focus on my experience of the infrastructure development in MMR per se. Then there have been a lot of coordination issues. You talked about the maps of utilities not being available. I know it from the municipal corporation side point of view, and I'm now a consumer of that information from the infrastructure development point of view, sitting in MMRDA, when we ask the municipal corporation to tell us where exactly the utility passes through, so that we will not dig up, we will not drill to construct our pillar for the metro. And sometimes we stumble upon that the map which was given was not correct, and the water mains get disturbed and all. So I know from the sitting on the other side that there are no maps actually certainly available where with utmost certainty they can say where is exactly the pipe. And when it comes to drilling and digging of a space, 4-5 meters is a huge gap. 4-5 meters here and there is a huge gap. So that is it. And I used to handle Brimstow Ward, the stormwater drain issue you were talking about, Brimstow Ward. And I came to know that the drains which were created, underground drains which were created, constructed during British period, the municipal corporation didn't have the map, but the original map was lying in London in one museum. So one of the professor from IIT, Professor Kapil Gupta, told me about this. Yeah, you are here. So he told me this story, and he went there and brought most of the maps. So he is basically having more information than even the municipal corporation, though we used to work together. So that's about it. And encroachment removal, there are other side of it. There are poor people who encroach upon slums and all, but there are rich people who park their BMWs and Mercedes on roads, and the actual width of the road which is available to you is half of what is constructed by the municipal corporation. And they don't think it as encroachments, whereas the slum will look a blot on the face of city. A BMW or a Mercedes being parked on the roadside will not look so bad. So that's the situation in which we all live. However, let me come back to the mobility part of it and the urban transport part of it, which is the biggest emitter of GHG gases. And we are sitting here for the climate crisis. So almost worldwide, 80% of the GHG emissions come from the transport sector. And it's there that cities like Mumbai, which in 1919 was the most congested city in the world as per the TomTom report, and this year it has become 4th number and Bangalore has become 1st. So it's not because that we have done anything, any miracle in last 1 year that it has come down. Maybe Bangalore has done worse, so it has gone up. So this city at one point of time had 75% of public transport share. So every day passenger traffic which happens in the city, 75% happen to be through the public transport. Now that percentage has come down to 65%, 10%. The reason is that over a year, since independence or so, we have not increased the capacity of either suburban trains, or we have not increased the capacity of another major public transport shareholder, that is BEST buses, city buses. So the capacities did not increase, whereas the population increased. So where will the population go? How will they travel? So they bought private cars, and that's how the congestion happened on the city roads. And since we hardly increased the capacity of the roads also, and as Philip Rod was saying, that widening the road does not give you answer of from congestion. It's like, I will say that, it's like loosening your belt. When you become fat, you think that by loosening your belt, you are solving the problem. You do not solve the problem of obesity. So it has to be solved in a different way. And that's how MMRDA and state government together, they thought of taking up an ambitious project of increasing the public transport capacity in this city. And 337 kilometers of metro lines have been planned. If all these lines, which the timeline is by 2025-26, we'll be able to construct 337 kilometers of metro in this city, will be able to more than double the capacity of public transport in this city. And by just doubling the capacity, which is not sufficient, though it is the basic condition, but it's not the sufficient condition. Sufficient condition will come from the first and last mile connectivity, for which we are working with motorized and non-motorized type of transport. Motorized in the sense of shared taxis and buses, and non-motorized in terms of e-scooters and cycles, so that the first and last mile connectivities are taken care of for the comfort of the commuters. And taken all these together, the public transport share will certainly increase from 65% to 75%. That's what we hope by 2041, when the population will be 32 million. Yeah. So this is the situation, and in that the metro is one. Then we are also constructing the longest sea bridge in this country, which is Mumbai Trans-Harbour Link, which will be ready by 2022. This year we are, will be commissioning almost 35 kilometers of metro lines, and every year henceforth, one line will come for commissioning. Hopefully by 2025-26, all these 337 kilometers of metro lines will be ready. With that, I don't think Mumbai will behave the way it behaves today. The congestion will reduce from 70% to almost 9 to 10% in the city. The fuel consumption will reduce by almost 30%. The air pollution will reduce, which mainly is from private vehicular pollution and all, will reduce by 58 to 60%. So this is how we have planned. Most of the metro components are also green by that nature. If time permits, I can speak about that. But now I stop it, I know, because you are short of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think great insights, and of course, very sort of interesting developments in the infrastructure sector in the city. We now turn to the final speaker, who's going to join us by video conference again. And he's going to present the Venice case study. And of course, Venice, we all know from personal visits and experiences on pictures. Well, it doesn't look very good. It's submerged completely in water. Over to you, Georg.
Yes. So thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm trying to share my screen now. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. Now, I'm very sorry that I could not come in person to your meeting, to your conference, but as if the climate emergency is not enough, now in Italy we have a coronavirus emergency. And I'm from one of the two regions where we have most of the cases, and it was very risky to try to fly to India. I could have even been stopped at the airport, for example. So it's better to do the presentation from here. Now this will be completely different. I will not say anything about rainfall. What the problem we have in Venice is storm surge, and I show you what is the problem. So, Venice is flooded 20 times a year. This is true now, but it can be worse, and it will be worse with this problem. And you can either fight against this. These are pumps that try to pump out the water that comes in through the cracks and through the toilets and whatever into the shops. You can also adapt to it. And this is, Venetians were always very creative, adapting to situations of high water. Well, you see, what is the biggest problem is that we have basically, below 110 centimeters of high water, we have only 10% flooded. Basically, it's only the San Marco Square and it's the Rialto. But when you go a little bit higher, then a lot of the city will be flooded. So every centimeter makes its difference. And therefore, this is also true that we need a very good forecasting system in order to be able to alert the population and in order to operate the safeguarding systems. So, just some examples. In 1966, we had the worst high water ever recorded, 194 centimeters, and this should have been an event which only had a return period of 200 years. So every 200 years, this should be possible. But then, in the 29th of October 2018, we had a terrible storm again. It was flooding Venice, but it was even doing worse in the forests that were in the Alps. And what happened at the end, that all these trunks of the trees were then inside the dams and the rivers, and it was a big disaster. So we thought, well, now this was it, and we would be safe again. No, 12th of November 2019, we had the second highest high water. And we did not only have the second highest high water, this came back 4 times in 1 week. So in 1 week, we had 4 exceptional high tides. And at the end, we were left with a big damage to the city, a big damage to the Cathedral of San Marco, and also big damages to the infrastructure and the transport. Question is, what can we do? Well, there is a project, it's called the MOSE project. It's a project where you would build mobile barriers, like 3x3 inlets, and simple thing is you build some barriers that can be put in place when you need them. So they had first tests in 2014, but this is already 6 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago. And unfortunately, the mobile barriers are still not ready. And this is one of the big questions now. Why did it take so long to complete these works? Because they were started in 2003. So now it's over 16 years and we're still working on that. They costed a real lot of money, more than 6 billion euro, and they're still not ready. There's a big discussion going on. I just have to say, if the mobile gates would have worked on the 12th of November, now nobody would discuss anymore and nobody would criticize them anymore. But however, they did not work, and therefore now we have a lot of discussions about this. How do they work, these mobile barriers? You see they're sitting on the floor, and if you need them, then you pump air into them, and these gates come up and then basically shelter the lagoon from the sea. As you can already see, this is a very complicated situation. In London, they showed us how you can do it much simpler with some pillars you put inside the river, and you have the Thames barriers there. Unfortunately, this was not possible in Venice. There shouldn't have been any visible parts of these mobile barriers in the inlets, and therefore they had to basically hide them on the floor. And this was what makes it so complicated. It made it much longer to complete these systems, and it also made it very expensive. Question is, can this mobile barriers protect Venice? Well, I have to say, if they were working on the 12th of November, they would have been perfectly able to protect Venice. However, there will be also problems with climate change, and then these will create problems on the operations of the MOSE. And above a certain sea level rise, which will be high enough, then the MOSE will not be able to avoid flooding anymore in the city. You see, we have here a diagram, the last 150 years you can see, and we have now an average water level which is something like 30 to 35 centimeters higher than 150 years ago. And the blue lines, the blue bars, show you how many high tide events we have, and you can see they are correlated, they're strongly correlated. So we are not able to say that the event of the 12th of November has been the climate change was responsible. That's not possible, but we can link the frequency of the high water events to what happens with climate change. So this is just I'm a numerical modeler, so I apply models, and here you can see different scenarios of different sea level rise scenarios. And if you look at the 50 centimeter sea level scenario, that would be basically around here, somewhere in the middle. You can see we will have a number of closures of the mobile gates of between 300 and 400 times. And this means we will have to close the mobile gates about once a day. This is clearly not possible anymore. And if you also look at the time of the closure, so how long we have to close them, if you go to 75 centimeters, then you have to close them around 4,000 to 4,500 hours, but the year only has 8,800 hours. That means we have to close them half of the time. This means that after 75 centimeters of sea level rise, we will not speak about closing the lagoon, we will speak about opening the lagoon. So what does this mean? Well, you see, before, Venice was always very connected to its lagoon. The city was connected to its lagoon. There was no distinction made. However, with climate change, with sea level rise, this relation might come to an end. And at a certain point, saving Venice is not saving everything. It will mean probably that we have to choose between what to save. Are we going to save the lagoon, or are we going to save the city? Well, the question is not even if this happens, but only when will this happen? When will it happen that we have a sea level rise of another 50 centimeters? And therefore, at the end, basically what we have to do is we will probably have to close the lagoon off from the Adriatic Sea. We will have to transform the lagoon into a freshwater lake. So this will be something very strong intervention. And we have this has to be planned in order to be. There must be a very good sewage system, and at the end, the industrial and touristic port, they have to be transferred out of the lagoon. And I am, somebody else already said this before, if you're talking about sewage systems and so on, this is not a very sexy topic. It's much better to build the MOSE system than thinking about the sewage system, clearly. And I leave you with one sentence. Do we have to think about the long run or the short run? Well, even if it's true that in the long run climate change will dominate, we also have to think about the short run. And this is, I would like to cite somebody who was also staying in India for some time of his life. It's John Keynes, and he says, in the long run, we are all dead. So we also really have to think about the short run. We have to think, what can we do now in order to do something for Venice? And what can we do for Venice and for the population in the next 30 to 40 years? And with this, I have finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. Wow. All right. So I think quite a sort of remarkable presentation. We have to really make a choice between sort of our natural ecosystems and our living environments. And how do we really have to, and climate change is going to make it imperative that we make a choice sooner rather than later. Keynes, of course, said this in a different context. So I hope we're not all dead in the long run. I would actually like to give the last word literally to my panelists because they've been so good. So you've heard, well, sort of the gentlemen who are here in sort of managing cities, managing government, working sort of very closely in solving the big problems, of course, within the constraints that they're working in. I would like to sort of make it a little difficult for you at the end of the session. What one word comes to your mind when you actually think about the climate crisis in your city or in the city that you're working in? What is that one word that comes to your mind? And maybe I can give you 10 seconds to think about it. And I'll start with you because you've actually set the bar a little too high with your creativity. Okay, no, please say it in the mic.
Disaster.
Disaster. Okay. Please think about something. I'm sure you can come up with something. One word that comes to your mind when you think about Surat and the climate crisis. Transformation. Okay, so disaster, transformation, the mayor.
See, if there is a political will, we can fight the climate change.
Okay, so political will.
Opportunity.
Opportunity. Okay, so here we have, it's a nice summary of the session, right? You actually have heard about the critical choices that we have to make. You have heard from people who are sitting in London as well as in Venice, well, in Tangier, not even in London, thinking about sort of problems around the globe. And here we have people who are at the forefront of trying to solve the problem and trying to deal with the crisis and working with multiple stakeholders and multiple interests. So we have disaster, we have opportunity, we have political will, we'll find a way, and transformation. So on this note, I'd like to ask you to all give my panelists a very round of applause. Because with their help, we've actually come back on time as well. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi, and to all my esteemed panel members. Can we please give them one more big hand? Very, very interesting session. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a short tea break, a short 5-minute tea break. Therefore, I'm going to request everybody to please help themselves to the refreshments and